Welcome. My name is Natasha Sherman and I am your host. And my guest today is Suzy Ismail. She is the founder and head communications counselor at Cornerstone. She's also the author of several books on the topics of marriage, divorce, and ethnic minorities in the workplace. And today we're going to talk about her book, Modern Muslim Marriage, Finding the Right Match and Making Your Marriage Succeed. Welcome, Suzy.
Thank you.
You've been here before. I'm always happy to have you come here and talk about your books, educate us, inform us. So let's talk about this book about modern Muslim marriage, because we typically think of, Western marriage kind of not doing well and other communities possibly doing better. And are there differences in the way we approach it? So maybe you can just let me know.
Absolutely. I think across the board today we are seeing families struggle. Families in all shapes, sizes, ethnicities, faith-based, all sorts of things. And we're seeing these struggles occurring for a variety of reasons. And many of the struggles that we see occurring in non-Muslim marriages and in families are also occurring in Muslim marriages and in Muslim families. Among those struggles are the stress of raising children in homes where largely today both parents are working. Financial stress is another huge burden. And my specific area of expertise is a lack of communication. So we are seeing among families across the board, regardless of faith and regardless of background, that these same problems are existing and occurring frequently. Interestingly enough, they're problems that could be avoided.
Yeah, and let's talk about how could they be avoided, because if it was a magic bullet, we'd all be taking it, and shoot me with it, because
Absolutely. I think without a doubt, education is the key. We take a lot of time to educate ourselves in terms of our careers, in terms of our day-to-day lives, making a living, things like that. But when it comes to the most important elements of our life, which is our relationships, we tend to think that learning is common sense, that we don't need to be educated. Nelson Mandela once said that education is the most powerful tool with which we can change the world. And I feel like education is the most powerful tool with which we can change the dynamics of our relationships. And this is, I think, the key. That is that magic bullet. Education prior to marriage, education during marriage, education. We're learning not only about yourself as an individual, but also about the dynamics of your relationships and what makes it work.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are other religions where, they prepare people for marriage, and, the world is changing and we're changing along with it. One of the things that for me, I think, it makes so much sense to kind of go into premarital counseling, not because you have problems, but because you want to get educated. And one of the things for me is defining expectations. I think there's so little of that, especially in a non-religious sector. It's like all about, the stars and the adrenaline and all of that. And everybody thinks that theirs is going to last.
Absolutely.
And clearly it doesn't. And it's not a bad thing, it's just a natural thing. But then we don't think, okay, what about after that? Like, what do we need to pay attention? What are the expectations financially and in terms of the kids and family, extended family? So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when my book came out, Modern Muslim Marriage, back in 2012, it was a direct response to an earlier book that I had written in 2010, which was called When Muslim Marriage Fails. The first book addressed the problems within marriages and the breakdown in marriages and what we're seeing happening that is causing a huge rise in the divorce rate among the Muslim community, just as we see in the larger American community as well. In responding to that, the book Modern Muslim Marriage came out with a focus on, all right, how do we do this right? And what I found in my research and in writing that book is that a lot of our building towards our marriages and our relationships actually begins before we even set our feet on the path towards finding a relationship, starting a relationship, or entering a relationship. And it begins with knowing ourselves. So when you talk about expectations, that is an absolutely huge part of a relationship. But for many of us, we don't understand ourselves well enough, and we don't know what our own expectations are before we begin to engage with another individual and try to understand their expectations. And until we get a better handle on who we are as individuals, it becomes very hard to enter into a relationship and make that relationship a success.
You know, it really makes sense, but, you know, that whole journey of self-discovery can, you know, it's like know yourself. Well, I know myself today. In 10 years, I'll know myself differently. So that's an ongoing journey. I think one of the things I heard in a talk you gave was if you're going into marriage thinking that this other person is going to complete you, yes, you're not ready for marriage. Mm-hmm. So I think to me that's a great starting point. You're not looking for somebody to be your, you know, completion, fill the pot. Mm-hmm. It's yes, really you feel that you want to share your life and who you are and travel the journey together, but not expect the other person to be the one who completes the missing pieces of who you are.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's kind of the concept that our counseling center Cornerstone is built upon. The idea that before embarking on a relationship, don't look for the relationship. Look for yourself first. Understand yourself. And you are absolutely right that self-discovery is a journey, and who you are today may not be who you are tomorrow. But the process of knowing yourself is knowing how to know yourself. You know, how do you get to know yourself? How do you know the person you are today? How will you know the person you are tomorrow? And how do you make time for that in your life when things get so crazy busy between
And what's the
everything?
answer?
What is the answer of knowing yourself? You know, part of it is understanding what motivates every human being. You know, what are your desires? You know, for many of us, we don't understand the motivation that pushes us towards something. So let's say there's someone who feels that, you know, they really want to get a certain degree, and this is they've always had this drive to get this degree. You can have that drive and say, I want XYZ. You know, I want to achieve XYZ without really knowing why. So being able to answer that question, why do you want that degree? Why do you want that car? Why do you want 7 kids? You know, why? And being able to answer why is the first part of knowing how to know yourself.
You know, it's great. Again, it goes back to expectations, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like, so I have this desire, but what do I expect as a result of that?
Yes.
And what's the motivating factor? And I think most of us will follow a passion without actually exploring that.
Yes.
So then another thing you talk about is the rate of, and I'm going to jump around because I want people to get like an overview of what you write about. The infidelity is on the rise in the Muslim community.
Yes.
And so let's talk a little bit about like, why do you think that's happening?
Okay. And again, I think, you know, when we talk about infidelity, for example, being one of the many factors that we see increasingly causing breakdowns in marriages, it's across the board. You know, again, we see it in the Muslim community, we see it in many other communities as well. What we are finding these days in particular regarding infidelity is that the infidelity that we're seeing is not necessarily, you know, the affairs of maybe 20 years ago, the clandestine meetings, the, you know, hidden behind a barn or something like that. That's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing instead is a great deal of emotional cheating and emotional betrayal. And a lot of that emotional cheating is being facilitated by the easy access to a variety of individuals, a variety of attitudes, personalities through online venues. So we see it happening a lot through Facebook, we see it through texting, we see it through you know, Twitter, through all sorts of different avenues, through you know, the swipe left, swipe right type of apps
And
that
you know,
we see.
it's interesting because what it really points to is it's a way to let yourself off the hook from addressing what's right in front of you.
Yeah.
So it's like shifting your gaze away from your relationship because it's much easier to, you know, find someone who you don't have all those daily struggles with.
Absolutely.
And then they understand you better.
Absolutely,
you know, kind of like that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of our views of love and marriage is built upon this concept of you know, euphoria and instant gratification. Mm-hmm. And as we move more and more into the realm of instant gratification and the idea that, you know, you send a text message, you want a response within 20 seconds, you know, we're losing that concept of the slow simmer that marriage really is. You know, essentially marriage is a slow simmer. It's not a constant boiling. It's not a constant, you know, fireworks or feelings of intense passion. passion at all times. Instead, it's meant to be a place of tranquility and serenity. And when you think of tranquility and serenity, you think of something that's mellow. But we tend to not view love and marriage in that way. We have the Hollywoodized version of love and marriage as constantly being exciting and passionate and filled with fireworks. And a lot of times when you don't get that instant gratification, when you feel like you're missing it because you're in that slow simmer state, you will look elsewhere for those pops of satisfaction or for that need to feel appreciated, that need to feel desired, which sometimes within a marriage, when things are in the slow simmer phase, either one or the other may not be feeling those particular emotions.
It's hard for us to give up on that fantasy. We're so brainwashed with it. I remember years ago reading this article, I think it was in the New York Times, but years ago, saying, has our version of romantic love destroyed relationships,
Yes.
And it's kind of like that, but it's hard. It's almost like a drug. How do you, say, hey, listen, here's what you have in these like fireworks moment, but let's look back here and here. What are your commitments? So I don't know how you convince people of that, but in terms of like counseling, what is the main thing that you deal with and you work with people?
Well, I think, just to respond to your earlier point before we head into the counseling realm,
Yes.
A lot of, what you're describing in terms of how romantic love has changed our view of marriage and possibly depleted our marriages. We also see a great deal of dependency these days, and the concept of almost like the attachment theory, where when we marry, we begin to assume that this other person is supposed to fill in all the empty holes in our lives, and that this person should be our best friend, our best spouse, the best parent, the best provider, the best partner, the best in so many realms. And as we move into more of an individualized type of a view in our communities, and we lose that sense of collectivism, we wind up seeing a great deal more of this dependency on husband and wife as being this nuclear unit.
The be all and the end all.
Yes.
Wow, that's really interesting, that whole thing about, losing your dependence on community and then expecting that other person to be your one and only.
Yeah.
I remember being in this training about the difference between men and women, and one of the things they said in the beginning was, and very clearly, they said, women, stop expecting your husband to be your best girlfriend.
Yes.
That's what you have your best girlfriend for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think as we start to distinguish, like there are different places that we could get those different needs met.
Yes.
The need for community, the
Yes.
need for male companionship, the need for female companionship, so that we're being nurtured at a lot of different levels.
Yeah, I think that's that's absolutely the case that we see, and that kind of leads right into our counseling paradigm as well. So our Cornerstone Center is focused on communication counseling, faith-based relational communication counseling, which means.
And is it just for Muslim families or?
Well, when we opened our doors about a year ago, our intention was to address the Muslim community because that's
Sure.
the area that we felt needed the most addressing, because there
Yes.
isn't a lot of counseling centers that focus on that. But what we found over the past year is maybe about 20% of our clients now are non-Muslim. So because there is that desire and that need, regardless of the faith that you come from, to get back to spirituality and to connect with the concept of marriage and family life to a greater whole. Because I think for many people today, the reason for marriage is starting to get a little bit lost. Why do I need to get married if I can live with someone and enjoy their company and not necessarily have to have that legal bond? And so what we're seeing a lot of today within our center is, yes, we do have the larger part of our clientele are Muslims, but a lot of non-Muslims who are seeking understanding and trying to see, what does marriage mean? What does family life mean? Why is it important? Why do I need to fight for it? What are the benefits of it?
And if you take it out of the religious context, and certainly I get, keeping the family together and the children's interests and everything else, but if you look at pre-family, so the question is, if there is no compelling faith-based reason to get married, why get married?
Right. And I think that's a very deep philosophical type of a question, that we probably won't be able to answer in just a half-hour episode. But I think the underlying need for marriage. It's as age old as like humanity itself. Regardless of the faith that you adhere to, any of the monotheistic faiths kind of start with the concept of Adam and Eve and this connection between partners who build upon something that is bigger than just themselves. So when we look at marriage rather than just a legal binding paper or as something that's greater than that, it's the point where an individual is able to look beyond themselves and to say, it's not just about me anymore, that there is someone else, something bigger. And what binds that something bigger is that sacrament of marriage, regardless of whether or not you have a religious ceremony or if common law, you've lived together for 7 years and now you're considered married, but something that is more binding than I am going to live with you and be your partner, but taking it to that next level of this is bigger than just you and me. This is something that we're going to work towards, an entity, an institution, something that has more sanctity in it than possibly just saying, I love you, you love me. Because the concept of love is defined differently, I think, for different people.
Yes, and again, it's an unanswerable question in a half an hour, like why, is marriage even valid, viable, whatever. But if you look philosophically at it, there is the potential for human growth and this idea of it's not only about me, it's about somebody else. And it's funny, I knew someone who was in a breakdown in their marriage, and they were talking to a counselor, and he said, you want to make your marriage a ménage à trois, between you and him and God. So it's like, bringing that into it, then it becomes something bigger than just the two of you. So I could see inside of a faith-based commitment where it would be very important to remember that.
Yes, absolutely. And like I said, a lot of the people that come to our counseling center are people that have been away from faith for a long time, where faith doesn't play an integral part in their day-to-day life, but they feel the need to bring that back into their relationship or into their family life, because it does give that hope possibly of beyond just the day-to-day. Sometimes it answers that question of what is the purpose of it all? And regardless of what your belief kind of directs you to do on a day-to-day basis, sometimes just having that purpose of there is a greater meaning to life. There is a greater meaning. Yes, a greater meaning to marriage, a greater meaning to family. Sometimes that alone, even if you can't fully define what that purpose is, but that purpose gives you guidance and allows you to say, this is worth it. I'm working towards something bigger than just, my limited understanding, even if I can't grasp it completely.
Right. So then the question is, how do you prepare, how do you teach people to communicate, when it's so easy to not do it directly?
Yes.
And how do you, because the reward is, again, immediate. Someone else, somewhere else that you don't have this history with. So how do you create the value of that?
Yeah. Again, I think we're taught from a young age that the idea of communication is common sense. It's something you're born with it. You know how to do it. But the reality is that it's probably harder than calculus or trigonometry. When I say the word tree, the tree that I may be thinking of could be a palm tree. But when I say tree, the one you might be thinking of is an oak tree or a willow tree. So when I say something, it's not always translated the way that I want it to be translated in your mind. Now add to that baggage and history and the past, and suddenly everything I say may be taken in a way that is different, and vice versa. So where we begin with our kind of restructuring the communicative view or how people communicate within relationships and within the family dynamics as well, is we begin with listening. Because we do a lot of talking and not enough listening most of the time. And there's a saying that God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we could listen more than we speak. But unfortunately, it's often the opposite. And it's not just listening to the other person, but we do a lot of listening to yourself. So oftentimes in our counseling sessions, we will actually, with the permission of the clients, of course, we'll record a counseling session. Just as the couple is speaking, we'll put something out there, a situation that happened last week, something that, the couple has brought up in the past. We put it out there and then we tell them, talk about it. We'll ask some direct questions and then we record the conversation. When they're done with the conversation, often it'll get a little fiery or heated up. We replay the conversation and we have each person listen to themselves. And 9 times out of 10, one person or the other will say, yeah, I said that, but I didn't mean that, or
Oh, that's interesting.
Yes, as we replay it and as people listen to their own voices, they'll say, well, that came out not the way I meant it, or
Right.
what I meant by that. And being able to put pause even when you speak yourself and really think about your words and think about how they're impacting the other person is the first step towards heading towards a communication dynamic that's successful for both parties involved.
What's interesting about that is that, as a life coach, it's really about I work with people to work on themselves. Mm-hmm. But relationship is such a powerful structure to do your work on yourself.
Yes.
It provides you with all the grist for the mill, know?
Absolutely.
So that it's not just about the relationship, it's about your personal development. So that every time you're confronted, and it's what you're doing, mm-hmm. listen to yourself. Oh my God, I didn't mean that. I didn't.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's really great, Mm-hmm. So if you look at it as just a vehicle for growth even.
Absolutely.
So one of the things you talked about also in a talk you gave was this whole idea of, so I love this idea of, we have to bring back the support of the community, extended mm-hmm. family, extended networks,
yes.
so that we're not looking to one person to fulfill every role possible. On the other hand, there's clearly when you get married, the family plays a huge role,
Absolutely.
And sometimes that can be problematic rather than supportive.
Absolutely. One of the levels of communication counseling that we provide is about creating boundaries, and boundaries not just for yourself, but boundaries for you as a couple and you as a family. Boundaries as parents and boundaries as for the in-laws as well.
Yes.
And creating those boundaries from the get-go, very early on in the marriage, is critical for being able to navigate together, as a couple or as a family, where your marriage is going to head afterwards. So as important as it is to have that network, whether it's with friends or family or extended relatives, the boundaries are key. There has to be that ability to say, okay, yes, I love my family, I love my parents, but I'm going to visit my parents this day, I'll visit your parents this day. We're going to spend one family vacation with this side, we'll spend another family vacation with that side, and we'll spend a family vacation by ourselves.
Yes.
Being able to find that balance is critical, and it's different
it's creating
for
a whole
everyone.
new separate unit.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Years ago I interviewed this guy from India, and
mm-hmm.
He had an arranged marriage. So I asked him questions about, did you get to say no? And he said yes. And I mm-hmm. said, what were your criteria? He was very clear about his criteria. He wanted someone who was educated, but not mm-hmm. more educated than him.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
He wanted someone who was going to be willing to work, and he wanted
mm-hmm.
someone who was going to be fully devoted to family life. Mm-hmm. So again, expectations clearly defined. And so he found the one that he thought would fit the bill,
okay.
and he got married. And when I was interviewing him, this was mm-hmm. years ago, he had been married for 25 years, they mm-hmm. had children, and I said to him, do you love her? And he said, with all my heart, from the day I said I would. And I thought that was like, that blew me away.
Yeah.
Not love as this kind of feeling that overwhelms you, but love
yes.
as a commitment.
Mm-hmm. And I think that conscious decision making is something that we may have lost sight of in these current times, because we are very much ruled often by the feelings and the emotions, because we feel that carries so much weight, rather than by the mindfulness and the conscious mindfulness of saying, I choose to love this person, I choose to be with this person, I choose to be good to this person. And it's something that even as parents, we need to do that with our children each and every day as well.
Yes, of course. Because sometimes they're not so lovable in the moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that consciousness, that ability to make those decisions and say, this is, by my mind I'm choosing, that doesn't lessen the impact of the love. It doesn't take away from the emotion.
I think sometimes it strengthens it because
absolutely.
You're choosing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think again, in the premarital stage, mm-hmm. it's very powerful to identify that and say, I'm committing to love you, even when I feel that you're being hateful or whatever.
Yes.
In that moment I may not love you, but my overwhelming commitment is to continue to love you and to cause that every day.
Yes.
That's much more sustainable.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the key reminders that we actually give our clients as well. We ask them to change their narrative and to change their dialogue with each other, where every night, rather than giving each other the peck on the cheek and saying I love you, instead to say I choose you. and that
Oh
constant
my God,
reminder of
that's
I
so
choose
great.
you.
I choose
Yeah.
you. Yeah, and you do it every day. And
Every
you recommit.
day, every day, every day.
Yeah, and then again, so the conditions of satisfaction are different and changing. I think I heard you say that one of the ways that you're getting people to meet one another is to create community events, because
Yes.
you're not allowed to date, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And so to create community events, and then out of that, take next steps. Does that work well?
So in the start, when modern Muslim marriage kind of came out in 2012, we began an initiative that really focused on trying to facilitate marriage, and part of that marriage facilitation was we came upon this difficulty where we found a study that had been done a few years back that said people who live with each other or date each other for 1 to 2 years prior to marriage or more had less chance of success in their marriage than people who didn't.
Wow.
And to us, that was mind-boggling because
is.
we always put so much emphasis on I need to know this person, I need to make sure this is the right person, when the statistics clearly showed that it didn't matter whether or not you thought you knew the person. That wasn't the defining factor as to whether or not a marriage would succeed. So we went about trying to research, what does it take to make a marriage succeed? What is it that strengthens a marriage? And we found that a great deal of that was having that shared sense of community, having friends that are, we're both husband and wife, having family that could get together, that could not necessarily be best friends all the time, but that there was that kind of a connection. So what we went about doing was we created social moderated activities, which consisted of really focusing people's interests on doing things that they enjoyed rather than meeting people that they enjoyed,
Right.
Because we thought that the dynamic would evolve into
Yes.
you meeting people who are like-minded if you're doing like-minded things. So each month we would have an activity, such as kayaking or roller skating or bike riding or a trip to the museum, different activities, that people might enjoy. And individuals who were interested in joining these activities were required to take a weekend education course on marriage, on rights, responsibilities, commitments, communication, understanding, the opposite gender, things of that sort. Once they completed the course, they could enter into any of our social moderated activities, and when there, if they found someone that they might be interested in, and again, it was just a very comfortable atmosphere, like
Right.
a group of friends going out together,
Yes.
What if they found someone they were interested in, they could speak to one of the moderators, and then what we were doing was smaller dinners where we would call up the person who they were interested in without telling them who issued the invitation, and tell them you're invited to a smaller gathering. And at the smaller gathering, there would be a handful of people, a less number of people, and they would be able to talk to each other again. If there was interest, again, we would kind of help move things along in the right direction. And if there was no interest, there was no awkwardness. There was no
Wow.
feeling of, oh my goodness, this person
It's really
is not
great.
interested.
And unfortunately we're out of time, but I think it makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And it's kind of very intentional as
Yes.
opposed to all this random stuff that, and then again, waiting for the sparks and waiting for
Yes.
the right moment. And yeah, it's really great.
Yeah,
Suzy, thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
on the show. And I invite people to check out your website, to check out Cornerstone. And then, of course, there are your other 3 books, When Muslim Marriage Fails, 9 to 5, Muslims in the Western Workplace, The BFF Sisters, Jenna's New Friends. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
My name is Natasha Sherman. Thank you for joining us.